an ethnographer of contemporary radical nationalism in Europe, assistant professor of ethnomusicology and affiliate of international affairs at the University of Colorado Boulder. His first book, Lines of the North, Sounds of the New Nordic Radical Nationalism, was recently published by Oxford University Press. His public commentary on immigration and extremism has appeared in Foreign Policy, Dagbladet, DN, and the New York Times. He's an up-and-coming scholar, like many of us. Ben is talking about, oh, you don't have an A and B. I'll let you announce your own title.
Thank you, Cheryl. It's a pleasure to be here, and as always, I'm impressed by the work that Cheryl and the Scandinavian program do here at UMass, and this symposium has certainly been a testament to how advanced and how productive that work is. As Cheryl mentioned, I consider myself first and foremost a scholar of the radical right in Europe in general and the Nordic countries and Sweden in particular. I'm also an ethnomusicologist, but as I tend to say to a lot of my colleagues who also consider themselves scholars of this political movement, I think that anyone who wants to study organized racism, organized anti-immigrant sentiment, especially as it takes place in Northern Europe and Scandinavia in the past decades, needs to be partially an ethnomusicologist. I could talk about that more, but all that is a bit of a preface to a paper that does not have anything to do with music whatsoever. And just as Nicole was mentioning at the beginning of her paper, so too is this paper in this presentation. I'm going to give you a working paper, and I think you'll understand why. What I have to talk about today is, I don't need that, no. What I have to talk about today is a drama that's unfolding in real time, and some of the material that we're discussing is such that it's just come out in the past weeks. Philosophy professor Justin Smith was grappling with the global rise of nationalism and right-wing populism when he wrote these words in a 2017 Harper's Magazine review essay. He was exploring the idea that with the emergence of President Trump, the US had imported a European product, that the anti-immigrant, nationalist, and populist parties infiltrating European parliaments throughout the past decade provided a model for political advance that the American Republican mimicked to startling effect. Now, accounts like these help us see Trump as an additional expression of a transnational zeitgeist posed to reshape the liberal order in the world. But they betray the fact that the anti-globalist forces today are heterogeneous, with contrasting and at times irreconcilable agendas and political styles. For many of these actors, Trump's rise to serve as an international icon for the populist right is cause for anxiety as much as celebration, spurring efforts to manage unwanted comparisons and associations while also capturing new opportunities for political advance. In my talk today, I explore this drama as it unfolds in one of the more fluid sites of Europe's nationalist wave, that surrounding the Sweden Democrats Party. Founded nearly 30 years ago, they first entered Parliament in 2010 with 5.7% of the votes as the only party to advocate appreciable reductions in immigration. After having doubled their share of the vote in 2014, they are now polling as the largest party in the country. The speed and size of their growth has no precedent in modern Swedish political history, though it should have been anticipated. Support for cuts in Sweden's exceptionally generous refugee policies have hovered around 50% throughout the past decade, and the Sweden Democrats emerged to fill that gaping niche. What is perhaps most remarkable about their rise and their arrival in Swedish politics is that it was so delayed and that its expansion hasn't been larger. But the party has been shackled and its desire to collaborate with other parties blunted by its historical and contemporary links with extremism. while the current leadership aggressively pursues a line of moderation, that agenda is at odds with elements of the party's past and untold portions of its grassroots, whose ideological orientations range from libertarianism to neo-fascism. Lacking any persuasive and unifying account of who the party is and what motivates its voters, the Sweden Democrats and their identity have been subject to speculation, in which nearly everything that is said about them can be seen as both true and untrue. But a source of apparent clarity appeared in 2016, as the Sweden Democrats found themselves compared with Donald Trump, their alleged ideological cousin, who dominated public discussions in Sweden much as in his home country. And there are plenty of senses in which the Sweden Democrats appear to resemble the US president and his movement. Both sides can be described as populist in the sense that their messaging focuses on an alleged divide between the people and the elite. And both align with rightist nationalism further by marking a division between said people and domestic minority groups, Muslims in particular. Both use contentious relationships with the media to propel their message. Both have been immune to scandal as well, whether it be the release of the infamous Hollywood Access recording where Trump can be heard bragging about grabbing women by the pussy, or videos of Sweden Democrat parliamentarians patrolling the streets of Stockholm with iron bars, calling women whores and men the equivalent of nigger lovers. Perhaps most importantly, their advance has been similarly traumatic for majorities in their respective countries, who see recent political change as having invalidated claims to national identities of liberalism and tolerance. However, differences between them are also impressive. The current Sweden Democrats' leadership would surely have expelled any party member who behaved and spoke in public like Trump. His overtures to state violence, mass deportations, ethnic discrimination, and outright prohibition of religious groups feed a stereotype that the Sweden Democrats' leadership has aimed to reject throughout the past decade. Additionally, the aesthetic of excess, overstatement, and bravado that propelled Trump's public persona is scarce in the Sweden Democrats, whose leader, Jimmie Åkesson, is often labeled a mother-in-law's dream, thanks to his soft-spoken tone, his gentle mannerisms, and his poindexterous appearance. The Sweden Democrats' efforts to negotiate affiliation with Trump are the focus of my talk today. The efforts themselves are tortured, fueled by the party's hesitation to embrace a movement with which it feels certain affinity, but also fears as a liability. However, it has also been generative in the sense that it provided party leaders a new set of external reference points against which to contrast and define themselves. It offered the party a new opportunity to say, we are not that, but this. What we will explore is thus the interaction among actors in the international right-wing populist movement, in the complexity of force and the complexity of the forces shaping its manifestations. In particular, we will see how the political earthquake that was the 2016 U.S. election sharpened the internal conflicts within the Sweden Democrats and exposed the challenges the party faces as it strives to become a governing force like its Nordic counterparts. To better understand how Trump might be reshaping the Sweden Democrats, we must first explore the party's history, as well as the boundaries its members place on their policy proposals and public communication. The identity of the party has been contested since its founding, and as this 2015 statement from its lead chief ideologue, Mattias Karlsson, indicates, leaders remain engaged in an attempt to police their borders to the right. The Sweden Democrats were founded in 1988 via the fusion of two organizations. One was the Swedish Progress Party, or the Svenska Framstegspartiet, an anti-establishment tax populist group that, like its more famous sister party in Norway, claimed to oppose immigration primarily on economic grounds. The other organization was called Keep Sweden Swedish, Bevara Sverige Svensk. And rather than a political party, Keep Sweden Swedish was a propaganda organization that arranged social gatherings and published a newsletter. They operated with an ideological and cultural profile far outside of the mainstream, opposing immigration based on an explicit concern for racial purity. While not neo-Nazi, as some commentators claim, the organization might nonetheless qualify as what today is called white nationalist, seeing as they demonized minorities and embraced a race ideology without explicitly targeting Jews or romanticizing the Third Reich. Keep Sweden Swedish also saw itself as belonging to the so-called national movement, the Nationella Rörelsen. The insider label applied to the explosion during the 1980s of nationalist parties, militant cells, and media initiatives committed as much to fashion and music-based skinhead subculture as to politics. Now, that legacy continues to plague the Sweden Democrats. From their founding and until the present, they have strived to break their ideological and cultural ties to the past while also moving toward the profile of their other parent organization, the Progress Party. Now, each turnover in leadership in the Sweden Democrats' nearly 30-year history has brought with it new efforts to expunge traces of race ideology and decadent subculture, either through mass expulsions or by introducing behavioral codes. In 1995, for example, the leadership found it necessary to issue rules for public events, prohibiting use of alcohol, cigarettes, symbols connected with World War II, and the shouting of slogans other than those endorsed by the party. As Thomas Johansson, a prominent party figure at the time, explained, quote, "The average Swede does not want to be linked with beer-drenched kids, sporting shaved heads, steel-toed boots, and screaming Sieg Heil." But while associations with skinheadism simmered, the party was working to moderate its platform. By the early 2000s, they began marking an ideological and methodological boundary between themselves and all other organized anti-immigrant forces in the country. That boundary would eventually be described as one between ethno and cultural nationalism. In the first instance, the divide related to competing notions of national belonging, with the first side asserting that inherited biological traits were indispensable elements of an ethnically or racially defined Swedish identity. While the second, cultural nationalism, declared that one could become a Swede by assimilating certain behaviors and values. Both nationalisms oppose the growth of immigration, but they diverge in their visions for minority groups in the country. Ethno-nationalists see no pathway for newcomers to become full-fledged members of the majority, and therefore advocate various forms of separatism, some of which can resemble forms of multiculturalism, as well as, of course, repatriation for foreign nationals. Cultural nationalists, on the other hand, believe that through assimilation and sharp restrictions on future immigration, a culturally homogeneous Sweden can be created or recreated, with current minorities being folded into the majority identity. There is, of course, a robust literature questioning the functional difference between ideologies like ethno and cultural nationalism, often alleging that talk of irreconcilable cultural differences among people is just a facade for racism. But among Swedish nationalists, the ethno-cultural divide is, if nothing else, a forceful social reality, impacting the organizations and even social circles in which activists move. Moreover, the divide often carries a set of associated political positions. Whereas ethno-nationalists train their animosity on a variety of ostensible non-Swedes, cultural nationalists often prohibit criticism of Jews, while focusing instead on the alleged cultural threat posed to Europe by Muslims. Likewise, whereas attitudes toward liberal democracy vary among ethno-nationalists, with some explicitly rejecting it as an activist tool or social ideal, cultural nationalists typically defend democracy, occasionally even rallying behind liberalism, secularism, feminism, or even gay rights against the alleged religious fundamentalism and anti-modernism of Muslims. Thus, nationalists may indicate, or at least be suspected of indicating, their position on this ethno-cultural divide based on, let's say, their attitudes towards Israel, the United States, the freedom of press, as well as the general posture of being an uncompromising idealist or forward-thinking moderate. Virtually all self-identified nationalist organizations in Sweden since the 1980s have been ethno-nationalists in some way or another. The latter-day Sweden Democrats are the only force to emerge from the late 20th century national movement with an explicit agenda of cultural nationalism, a model for assimilation they call open Swedishness. The party's past relationships with ethno-nationalism remain a source of insecurity, and they have led Swedish Prime Minister Stefan Löfven to label the Sweden Democrats neo-fascists and Nazis. But to this day, crossing that ethno-cultural boundary, whether in questions of national identity or attendant issues of political methodology, counts as the cardinal sin for party members, and no other allegation has been as lethal for those facing marginalization or expulsion. The Sweden Democrats thus occupy a paradoxical position in relation to other far-right parties in Europe. Their connections to extremism are more recent and direct than many of their counterparts in the Nordic region and beyond. Moreover, leading members maintain cultural, if not ideological connections to the 1990s skinhead movement, and have identified as nationalists throughout much of their history, in contrast to leaders of other anti-immigrant parties in the region. However, their current proposals and standards for political discourse place them within the moderate wing of Europe's anti-immigrant populist wave. And all of this makes branding a fraught exercise, one that is often undermined by the party's variegated profile and the ideologically and socially diverse membership it attracts. It's thanks to struggles over identity that internal strife continues to plague the party, and that their attempts to distance themselves from the past are so frequent, and in the eyes of some outsiders, often exaggerated. The various prohibitions that the Sweden Democrats place on themselves would be violated, however, by a rising figure in the West with whom they would be associated.
Yes. When Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best. They're not sending you. They're not sending you. They're sending people that have lots of problems, and they're bringing those problems with us. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people. But I speak to border guards.
Donald Trump's campaign branding speech, delivered in the Trump Tower atrium on June 16, 2015, signaled both similarities and dissimilarities with the Sweden Democrats. On the one hand, his claim that crime and debauchery were being imported to the West via non-Western immigration paralleled core discourses of many anti-immigrant forces across the Atlantic. Likewise, his heedless and unapologetic tone was symptomatic of populist expression devised to defy politically correct status quos. On the other hand, that same statement exhibited the blanket demonization and anti-intellectualism, I would dare to say, that nationalists like the Sweden Democrats have been striving to wash from their profile. Indeed, as Trump's campaign convulsed over the following year and a half, he repeatedly emerged as a figure belonging broadly to the Swedish nationalist ideological sphere, while also behaving in ways that would have left him vulnerable to expulsion had he been a member of the party. Such incriminating behavior would have stretched beyond his scandalous accounts of having sexually assaulted women in the past and collided with standard boundaries more often tested and acted upon in the Sweden Democrats' self-moderation agenda. Race nationalism, in the sense that it's thought of among organized nationalists in Sweden, was never explicitly championed in the Trump campaign. Yet various expressions he made throughout the fall of 2016 nonetheless placed him outside the bounds of what would have been tolerated among the Sweden Democrats. Most notably, his allegation that an American judge would be unable to rule fairly on a pending lawsuit against him because of the judge's Mexican heritage. And that's a statement that Republican Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan, labeled a textbook definition of racism. Quote. Trump's celebration of state violence and apologetic stance toward contemporary authoritarian regimes also place him outside the bounds of the Sweden Democrats' preferred conduct and ideology. During the presidential campaign, Trump advocated the use of torture as an interrogation technique, adding that he would embrace it as a purely punitive measure, regardless of its effectiveness in producing useful security intelligence. Even if torture doesn't work, they deserve it, he clarified during the rally. During a Republican primary campaign debate, he also expressed a desire to see U.S. military attack the families of terrorists. Compare that with the Sweden Democrats, whose high-ranking parliamentarian Björn Söder was in 2009 compelled to retreat from an offhand statement that he supported capital punishment and clarify that he was speaking on his own and not the party's behalf. But Trump's warm reception of Vladimir Putin stood out as directly agitating a major ideological fault line around the Sweden Democrats. Open criticism of the Russian leader has not only flowed in the party's public messaging about the importance of increased defense spending, compulsory military service, and new security measures in the Baltic region, it has also been used internally to assess party members' commitment to democratic ideals, oftentimes in the context of potential expulsion cases. The potentially compromising effects of association with Trump in Sweden were made more tangible by his dismal showing in opinion polls. According to a YouGov survey conducted between September 16th and 19th, 2016, only 9% of Swedes said they would have voted for Trump, compared to 59% for Clinton. At first glance, such figures appear to place Sweden within rather than beyond the mainstream of sentiments in Western Europe. A survey by Infratest from October 4th to the 5th, for example, showed that only 4% of Germans would vote for Trump. And one by YouGov and The Economist, taken from October 3rd to the November 2nd, showed that he had only 4% of support among Danes. However, in polling that tracked overall approval or confidence in governing, Sweden appeared exceptional in its aversion to the Republican candidate. A Pew Research poll taken from April 6th to 28th, 2016, across 10 EU nations, exploring confidence rather than hypothetical votes, showed Swedes as having the highest no-confidence numbers for the Republican candidate at 92%, just ahead of the Germans at 89%, the Dutch at 88%, and France, the UK, and Spain at roughly 85%. As poorly as Trump fared among Sweden's voters as a whole, so too are there indications that his support was lukewarm among the Sweden Democrats and far-right parties in Europe more generally. A Sanito study from mid-September in 2016 showed Sweden Democrat voters evenly split in their support for Trump and Clinton. A division that reappeared in October in an Economist poll showing a plurality of support for Clinton among voters for the National Front in France, the Progress Party in Norway, Alternative for Germany, and the Danish People's Party. Only Britain's UKIP voters seem to favor Trump, according to that study, though a Pew Research survey mentioned earlier nonetheless found Trump's unfavorable ratings among UKIP voters to be as high as 66%. The Sweden Democrats' political opponents undoubtedly identified this as an opportunity, and they moved to associate the party with Trump. Center Party leader Annie Lööf said of Trump, quote, "He belongs to the same gang as Vladimir Putin, Marine Le Pen, even Jimmie Åkesson. But these are populists who peddle simple solutions to very complex problems, who paint the world in bleak colors." Critical media began characterizing the party and its relationship with Trump and other right-wing populist leaders in similar tones, accelerating those efforts in particular as Trump began securing the Republican nomination in late spring of 2016. They stand for the same threatening form of nationalism, as one headline coming from Dagens Industri, framing these side-by-side images of the Sweden Democrats leader Jimmie Åkesson with Trump. An editorial in the country's largest evening paper proclaimed in a discussion of Trump, Putin in Russia, Orban in Hungary, Le Pen in France, Erdogan in Turkey, but authoritarian populists are gaining ground in every country. We have the Sweden Democrats, end quote. Now, responses to Trump from the Sweden Democrats varied, reflecting divergent opinions of the Republican candidate, both among their grassroots as well as among their official spokespersons. Silence was one tactic used by the party when facing questions about the US election. Local Sweden Democrats in the southern province of Blekinge, when asked as part of a newspaper survey, refused to endorse either candidate, citing insufficient insight into American politics. And they were the only interviewees not to voice support for Clinton. Other party members were more outspoken in public and private about their aversion to Trump. A member of parliament and spokesperson on integration, Markus Wiechel, who has also donated and volunteered for American Democratic presidential candidates in the past, was forthright in media and closed party circles about his opposition to the US Republican. But the most covered reactions to Trump from the Sweden Democrats came from party leader Jimmie Åkesson, who declined to embrace the Republican candidate during the US presidential campaign. Early during the election season, Åkesson clarified during an interview that he could not call himself a supporter of the then Republican candidate, adding, quote, "Donald Trump and I diverge considerably as politicians, how we express ourselves and what we talk about." He did acknowledge agreeing with the US Republican that Muslim immigration posed the most serious threat to the West, but added, quote, "The way Trump expresses himself, that you need to close the borders, otherwise there will be terror attacks behind every bush, I don't find that serious." End quote. Now, these statements are noteworthy because of their omissions, of course. Åkesson's focus on methods of expression left open the possibility that he sympathized with the content of Trump's policies, or proposed policies. However, subsequent statements by Åkesson seemed less equivocal and understated in their opposition. He attempted, for example, to use Trump as a weapon against his opponents, accusing the left in Sweden of having Trumpified political discourse by perpetuating anti-intellectualism. Such commentary could give the impression that all party members were opposed to Trump or disinclined to express their support for him in public, but this was not the case. Former Sweden Democrats leader Mikael Jansson, here on the left, stated his enthusiasm for the US Republican through an op-ed in the mainstream Expressen evening paper just days before the election. The article declared, quote, "If Donald Trump wins the American presidential election, it will be a great victory for the United States," and listed the ways that a more isolationist and Russia-friendly America could advance global peace. The Sweden Democrats-affiliated magazine Samtiden likewise became a core outlet for high-profile members who supported Trump. Some writings, like that by party member and skinhead musician Ulf Hansson, here shown on the right, directly criticized Åkesson and the party leadership for not standing behind the US Republican, writing, quote, "Trump has a lot to teach us about how to deal with a vindictive liberal establishment. He has shown courage against those who hold us back, and that inspires hope." The division between those party members who publicly express support versus those who remain silent or criticize Trump parallels a key political divide, and I think this is quite important. Figures like Ulf Hansson and Mikael Jansson have in the past mobilized against the party leadership in personnel and ideological conflicts. In those instances, Hansson and Jansson spoke on behalf of a more ideologically radical, sometimes allegedly ethno-nationalist, wing of the party facing expulsion, and in opposition to what they saw as an ever more liberalizing Åkesson administration. Support for Trump, it seems, functioned as a litmus test, an additional site for party members to profile themselves as either doctrinaire or reformist, as either critics or loyalists of the party leadership. Indeed, Swedish nationalists outside and to the right of the Sweden Democrats highlighted Åkesson's reluctance toward Trump as only the latest instance of acquiescence to the liberal establishment and a symptom of a party leadership out of touch with the radical nationalism of its supporters. Virtually all high-profile members expelled or sidelined by the party in recent years, like Patrik Ehn, Christian Wessling, Vavra Suk, William Hane, Gustav Kasselstrand, Erik Almqvist, or Kent Ekeroth, for those of you who are following this, virtually all of those people have publicly endorsed the U.S. Republican. The militant neo-Nazi Nordic resistance movement followed Åkesson's commentary on Trump closely, often trailing it with articles on its website showcasing instances where the Sweden Democrats' leader balked in his support. The same was true of generic ethno-nationalist media outlets in Sweden like Fria Tider. But the pro-Trump faction of the Sweden Democrats failed to garner significant media attention. On the contrary, and outside of anticipated efforts among left-wing media to link the party with Trump, many commentators made unexpected moves endorsing the notion that the U.S. Republican and the Sweden Democrats did indeed, to go back to the words of Jimmie Åkesson, diverge considerably, both in style and in content. One of the most critical voices in the media toward the Sweden Democrats, Aftonbladet reporter Lena Melin, offered, if not a compliment to the party leader, then a recognition that the threat posed by the Sweden Democrats was not comparable to that of the U.S. presidential candidate. She wrote, quote, "God protect us from a Swedish Trump. He would mop the floor with the relatively uncharismatic Jimmie Åkesson. We would have a society and a debate climate that no responsible person could wish for." Still, other commentary was genuinely laudatory of the Sweden Democrats. Managing editor at Expressen newspaper, Magnus Aslelind, offered a rare and more substantial compliment to the party while contrasting them with Trump. Quote, "I believe that the Sweden Democrats have matured in such a way as is fitting for a party that represents such a large part of the electorate. The first signals from Donald Trump do not provide hope for a similar progression." Trump's presence in the media spotlight, in other words, afforded the party new opportunities to rebrand itself, perhaps even find new receptiveness to its profile in otherwise hostile media. Trump, it seemed, was serving as an instrument in the party's ongoing effort to distance themselves from extremism. In the past, those efforts had centered on using more radical nationalist forces as examples with which to draw a contrast. The Sweden Democrats were able to point to the now defunct ethno-nationalist National Democrats Party, or the Party of the Swedes, as organizations deserving of the labels racist and fascist, in contrast with themselves. The marked marginalization of those groups made the strategy relatively unproductive for the Sweden Democrats. Both the National Democrats and the Party of the Swedes were tiny little political parties. But if Trump could serve the similar function, perhaps the scenario would play out differently. A figure whose omnipresence in media would provide ample opportunity for the party to contrast alleged excesses of others with their own reasonableness. Trump's surprise victory on November 8, 2016 was poised to change things. Or at least that seemed to be what European nationalist politicians anticipated. Throughout the continent, their support for Trump became more vocal and unequivocal following the election. Geert Wilders of the Dutch Party for Freedom reacted to Trump's election in a Russia Today interview stating, quote, "America regained its national sovereignty, its identity, it reclaimed its own democracy," and described the then president-elect as a leader poised to champion the concerns of the American voter, and that he succeeded, quote, "despite all the negativity spread about him by the political elite and the press." Likewise, Marine Le Pen of France's National Front tweeted on the night of the election, quote, "Congratulations to the new President of the United States, Donald Trump, and the free American people." She would later make a sensationalized, if somewhat mysterious visit to Trump Tower in mid-January of this year. Attitudes seem to change among the Sweden Democrats' public figures as well, if only in more subtle ways. One of the first statements from party members came in a November 11, 2016 episode of a party-sponsored podcast series. Then, members of Parliament Linus Bylund and David Long each offered reactions to Trump that were tempered when compared with those of other nationalists, but still more laudatory than the party leadership's earlier messaging. Bylund remarked, for example, quote, "Even though I was careful not to embrace anybody ahead of time, I would of course rather see Trump win than Hillary, for a number of reasons. Not the least because a bunch of people who are deeply involved in the Swedish establishment deserved the shot to the gut that it was for them." David Long responded by echoing Bylund's emphasis on the importance of Trump's victory to local politics in Sweden. He said, quote, "I'm thinking along the same lines. I'm not sure whether electing Donald Trump is what the U.S. needs. That's for the American people to decide. On the other hand, it feels like it is what Sweden's establishment needs. They got a reminder that just because an entrenched media establishment rips a candidate apart, it doesn't mean that candidate will lose. Voters see through that. It was pretty clear during the election coverage on Swedish television. You could see that the journalists and reporters were thinking that something like this could happen in Sweden. A party that doesn't have the media in its pocket could still win." End quote. These politicians spoke having generalized Trump's movement as an instance of the people defeating the establishment. It was by describing the election in those terms, rather than highlighting the victory of Trump the person, that they were most willing to align developments in the U.S. with their agenda in Sweden. Indeed, the move to embrace the movement surrounding Trump rather than the candidate himself emerged as the apparent working plan of the party heads immediately following the election. And it was also the approach used by leader Jimmie Åkesson. In contrast with other nationalist and non-nationalist leaders on the continent, Åkesson's tone remained steady after the November 8th election. His commentary eschewed, in other words, the newfound enthusiasm for Trump blossoming among his counterparts to the South. And to the extent that he praised the outcome, he did so in relation to the general people versus establishment problematics of his fellow party members. Immediately following the U.S. election, he was interviewed on Sweden's TV4.
Vanligt folk, den tenderar att växa.
Känner du en slags släktskap då med Donald Trump och den rörelse som han säger då att han har?
Nej, men jag känner ett släktskap med de som röstar på honom delvis, tror jag. Alltså Donald Trump är en väldigt extrem person, får man säga. Det har inte minst den här valrörelsen visat. Men de som har röstat på honom är ju en väldigt bred grupp av väljare, tror jag. Men som man skulle kunna betrakta som vanligt folk i ordets rätta bemärkelse, som inte identifierar sig med den här urbana popkulturen, utan som är i första hand människor kanske som inte lever i de här områdena. Så.
Är du kanske en av få partiledare som känner glädje och firar det?
Jag känner inte glädje. Alltså, jag har sagt hela den här valkampanjen att jag är väldigt glad att jag slipper rösta i det här valet. Därför att världens mäktigaste land inte kan prestera att få bättre presidentkandidater än de här båda, det övergår mitt förstånd faktiskt. Men av två onda ting så fokuserar jag gärna min analys på just det här, alltså diskrepansen mellan eliten, etablissemanget och folket. Och den tycker jag är väldigt tydligt, och det som jag sa, det har vi sett också i Europa.
So Åkesson here sought to align himself with Trump's movement while disavowing association with the man himself, labeling the president-elect extreme and the lesser of two evils. And in subsequent statements on the American election, say on Swedish television, for example, on November 13th, 2 days later, Åkesson again attempted to make domestic lemonade of this foreign fruit, contrasting his party with the U.S. Republican while criticizing his opponents in Sweden. He said, quote, "What we need to learn from the election campaign in the U.S. is that things can't become like that here. We already have an extreme polarization in our discourse, tough rhetoric from both sides, really, not only from people on my side. I think it's time we all begin to think about this, unquote. The message from Åkesson was clear. He and Trump were not the same, and he was committed, in the spirit of moderation and professionalism, to keeping the hyperbolic nature of contemporary American politics out of Sweden. As during the campaign season, conversations about Trump after the election were taken as opportunities for identity branding and distancing the Sweden Democrats from their boorish stereotype. In domestic, disincentives for embracing Trump held firm. An Aftonbladet survey taken after the election, but ahead of the presidential inauguration, showed that 64% of Swedes anticipated Trump would do a, quote, somewhat or very bad job as president, while only 15% thought his contribution could be positive. Figures that may indicate only a nominal gain in support after the election. Add to that the fact that some of the only political voices to be found celebrating Trump's victory in the country were the very actors the Sweden Democrats have been most committed to disassociating from. That is to say, nationalists to their right. Simon Lindberg, leader of the militant neo-Nazi Nordic resistance movement, reacted to Trump's victory with an article headlined, quote, "Trump's victory is one of many indications that our people isn't going to cheer its own march towards death anymore." It's a long title. And expelled former heads of the Sweden Democrats' youth wing, Gustav Kasselstrand and William Hane, screamed, quote, "This is fantastic. The revolution has begun," on their election night podcast, after posting this photo of themselves in the MAGA hats, getting ready to cheer the outcome with champagne. Were the Sweden Democrats and their leaders to partake in the same public jubilance, their detractors would have a new dimension through which to align them with all far-right extremists in the country, opposite everybody else. Well, the Sweden Democrats' leadership continued with its careful and conditional reactions to Trump throughout his election and inauguration. An episode in the Trump administration stood to alter the trajectory of his reception in Sweden. On Saturday, February 18th, Trump traveled to Florida to speak at a campaign rally aimed at mobilizing support for his agenda amid political struggles and historically low approval ratings. And for the first time in a major speech, he mentioned Sweden.
Here's the bottom line. We've got to keep our country safe. You look at what's happening. We've got to keep our country safe. You look at what's happening in Germany. You look at what's happening last night in Sweden. Sweden. Who would believe this? Sweden. They took in large numbers. They're having problems like they never thought possible.
Now, reactions to the statement initially focused on Trump's reference to, quote, last night, which appeared to indicate that some destructive incident tied to immigration had occurred in Sweden on Friday, February 17th. No such incident had taken place, and ridicule of the president's comments ensued. Former Swedish Prime Minister Carl Bildt responded on Twitter, writing, quote, "Sweden? Terror attack? What has he been smoking?" And a satirical hashtag, "Last Night in Sweden," spread through social media on both sides of the Atlantic. Trump would later clarify that with, quote, "last night," he was referring to a television segment on Fox News' Tucker Carlson tonight. That segment featured an interview with British filmmaker Ami Horowitz, who presented clips from a documentary he made exploring ethnic conflict and alleged crime committed by immigrants in Sweden. Trump never meant to claim, in other words, that the country had been subject to a terrorizing incident. Ever defiant, he nonetheless tweeted the following morning, quote, "The fake news media is trying to say that large-scale immigration in Sweden is working out just beautifully. Not, exclamation point. Not as in Wayne's World. And as if on cue, that same night, Riots with unclear purpose broke out in an immigrant-heavy Stockholm suburb, leading conservative media worldwide to return to the story with an air of vindication and right-leaning Twitter users to repurpose the once satirical "last night in Sweden" hashtag. More recently, in an interview with Time magazine, Trump referred to that riot and the sequence of events as a piece of evidence supporting his claim that his tweets could be prophetic. All of this, of course, was too much for the Sweden Democrats to resist. Whatever reservations they held toward Trump seemed to fade in the wake of an international debate highlighting their primary political issue. And their efforts to capitalize brought the party unprecedented exposure. Chief ideologue Matthias Carlsson was interviewed on February 21st of this year on CNN's primetime news special Amanpour, where he said, quote, "I'm very grateful to President Trump that he addressed this issue. It is very important to us here, and I understand the motive for why he did it. There is a discussion right now about border controls and refugees in the United States. I think Sweden is a good example to put forward as a bad example," end quote. More notable publicity came the following day, however, when Carlsson, together with Jimmie Åkesson, published an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, given the title, quote, "Trump is right. Sweden's embrace of refugees isn't working." The piece centered on the 2015 refugee crisis and its various impacts on Swedish society, noting, quote, "Trump did not exaggerate Sweden's current problems. If anything, he understated them." And it goes on to declare the party's intention to, quote, "make Sweden safe again." The language of the article seemed intent on framing the Sweden Democrats as a player within a transnational movement inspired by Trump. And in that sense, it marks a potential watershed in this drama. One could only assume that aligning with Trump in that moment seemed to the party leadership not only ideologically sound, but also strategically advantageous, as if the president's brand might gain new political currency in Sweden and possibly provide a boost to the Sweden Democrats. Such hopes would have fizzled fast, I think. A Novus survey taken the following week, March 2nd to the 8th, showed only 42% of Sweden Democrats voters had a favorable view of the president. A number that, if read against the Senito survey taken from September 2016, signaled stagnant, if not slightly declining support for Trump among its core. In the March 2017 poll, it contained a figure of greater consequence for the party. It showed 80% of Swedes in general having an unfavorable opinion of the president, with only 10% viewing him favorably. Put in other terms, support for the American president among Swedes, even after he championed a relatively popular message, was roughly half of the support for the Sweden Democrats at the same time. And that, in general, brings us to today. Trump hasn't made any further remarks on Sweden, and the Sweden Democrats haven't offered any public statements on Trump, at least none that would be included in the same category as those earlier. And their campaign to embrace him, that accelerated following his comments in Florida, seems to have stalled. The party now seems intent on returning to its previous approach. Matthias Carlsson, the chief ideologue and group leader in Parliament, one of the co-authors of the Wall Street Journal op-ed, described the situation to me just 2 weeks ago during an interview. He described it thusly. He said, quote, "On the one hand, we want to take a sober look at the proposals that come from Trump and deal with the fact that a significant minority of our voters have a positive impression of him. At the same time, we don't want to be placed in the same corner as Trump, in part because we don't think that's right to do. There are real differences between us. And further, it isn't strategically beneficial. If Trump does something good, we need to say it. At the same time, we need to point out that there are real differences. We have to be able to criticize him. So this means that we need to take our positions on an issue-by-issue basis. When he does something good, like when he highlighted the problems in Sweden, even if he did it in a special way, then we can praise him. And when he makes decisions we think are poor, we have to criticize it. Sweden's media and our political opponents have worked hard to connect us to Trump from the start, because they've drawn the conclusion that it will probably hurt us. And I think that is the correct conclusion. So that means there will be a difficult balancing act for us going forward, end quote. Now is where I might give you the otherwise obligatory statement about not knowing where this relationship is going, and that will take time to draw meaningful conclusions and so on. But there is a lesson we can take away at this early juncture. Namely, that if we want to speak about an international anti-liberal movement stretching across Europe's nationalist parties, out to Trump and to Putin, and perhaps beyond, we need to be mindful about the different histories and settings distinguishing its component parts. Trump has helped us to see anew the entrenched divisions, in fact, in the Sweden Democrats. Those between the populist Framstegsparti and the white nationalist Bevara Sverige Svenskt in their various subsequent incarnations. Perhaps the reason his presence may be agitating that division in his contemporary eras is that he confounds it. He is neither a full-blown, explicit race ideologue at home in the ideological and stylistic milieu of 1990s skinheadism, nor the sober cultural conservative of the Sweden Democrats' leadership's aspirations. He draws elements from both those Swedish archetypes, both those archetypes from Swedish nationalism. And that makes his wholesale embrace or rejection a problem for Åkesson and the rest of the leadership. By exploring the trouble Trump's presence is causing the party internally, we also gain insight into some of the reasons why the Sweden Democrats, despite their remarkable growth, struggle to advance as a political cause. Thank you.
Well, thanks to Ben for this broad view of both, I guess you'd say, political science on both sides of the Atlantic. I guess when I was thinking about the paper, one of the things that struck me was the quote from, were this statement by Matthias Carlson, who on Facebook talked a little bit about one of the themes of your paper, which is this recasting, or this multiple opportunities for the Sweden Democrats to recast their identity or finally come to some kind of consensus about what the party stood for. And this is just a very small snippet of it, but it's a phrase that I think you translate as, it is of course completely okay to find inspiration and radicalism and street activism from the Sweden Democrats of the 1990s. And then he continues and says, but just not inside the walls of the party. And that made me think about the 1990s as a cultural moment in Sweden. And of course, it's not just the Sweden Democrats that we think of back then, because the influence is quite small, but also we think of New Democracy, Ny Demokrati. And in thinking about this earlier iteration of a far-right party in the 1990s, it makes you think more broadly about other things going on in Stockholm at that time and in Sweden at that time. These, of course, include what was described as the laser man, the sort of targeted assassination of immigrants by a mass murderer. But particularly, I want to focus not on the 1990s, but on the 2000s, because I started making a list in my head of an effort in the 2000s to think about the 1990s, to think about cultural politics in Sweden in the 1990s. And so I came up with a kind of ordered list of things that are interesting about the 2000s take on the 90s. And I guess this has to start in 2002 with the journalist Gellert Thomas, who wrote The Laser Man, a story of Sweden in 2002, which is essentially this kind of really in-depth, thick, historical journalistic attempt to understand the gentleman who we would eventually know as Ausonius, the whole discovery of who he was and why he did what he did. And then I think about we talked about this earlier, the Sommarprat, the kind of radio host job that Kamiri did for Swedish radio in 2004, where he sort of takes 45 minutes and talks and plays a bunch of interesting songs that were popular in the 90s. But throughout those songs, he weaves in what it was like to be a teenager in the 1990s in Sweden. Even everything from what was it like to ride the bus or to ride the subway as somebody who is a visible minority, to what hip-hop did he like, to how did he and his friends feel when the Laser Man was going on. And then I thought a little bit about Farnazar Bobby's 2006 recasting of Wilhelm Muberry's The Emigrants, not as a story of people leaving Sweden, poor people leaving Sweden and going to America, but rather as folks from the global south coming into Sweden. So the play was put on throughout Sweden in 2006, and it's just basically flipped. So the people who were Swedish in Muberry's original tale are instead coming from outside. But that features an actual kind of on-stage assassination of one of the figures by a kind of laser sight from a rifle. So in the original Muberry, it's just somebody who dies, and in this, it's somebody who's shot by the laser man. And then finally, also in 2006, the publication of Kamiri's second novel, Monocore, which does talk a lot about the laser man. So I guess my question for you in all of this is, given this litany of how the 2000s has tried to come to terms with the 1990s, this notion of recovering a kind of history of racial politics in Sweden, racialized violence, do you think this has been effective in framing Ny Demokrati or the Sweden Democrats in a broad sense, not just in within left-wing cultural circles? Do you think that any of these plays, journalism, novels, has it affected the Sweden Democrats' efforts to police their right wing, as you say it? Has the effort by, what you would probably say is kind of folks interested in racial justice, has this culture that's come out trying to talk about the 1990s, does this resonate at all? Does it in any way participate or push against the Sweden Democrats' attempts to define themselves?
Thank you, Peter. I'll do my best in my response here to kind of keep my conversation out of the weeds for those of you who aren't well-read or familiar with the recent cultural history and social history of Sweden. It has become something of a mantra among commentators, political scientists as well, to say, don't think that the election of the Sweden Democrats was such a big deal when it happened in 2010, because remember, Sweden has already in fact had an anti-immigrant party in its parliament. I belong to a group of people who disagree with that notion, and this is very important to get to what you're referring to. When Peter talks about New Democracy, Ny Demokrati, he's talking about a protest party that emerged in the early 1990s. It had two political leaders. Both of them were characters. They were certainly populist in the sense that they saw themselves coming to disrupt the order of the elites. Their opposition to immigration, which became one of their signatures, actually emerged gradually, and it strengthened throughout their very short period of representation. It was not as central a piece of their political movement as I think it's being treated by some retrospectively. Why does that matter? When you were looking at characterizations of the 90s in Sweden, much of the anti-immigrant cause, organized opposition to immigration, xenophobia, whatever type of label you'd like to put on it, is most often, especially within the party, thought of as a cause of hooliganism, a cause of brutal, violent, and also youthful. I mean, organized, coalescing around an oppositional youth subculture, skinheadism. Why were they like that? How come there was no real political party to vent their perspective and their discontent with multiculturalism, with immigration? They had to turn to skinheadism. They had to turn to deviance. Their position became decadent because there was no mainstream outlet for it. That's where all this works together. So whether it is in history, whether it is in the let's say expressive culture and theater and literature and music, that is part of the contrast that the Sweden Democrats work with. You'll hear people today say, oh, doing Heil Hitler salutes, tattooing swastikas on your arm, that's so 90s. As opposed to something else.
Yeah.
And that's very important for them. Not just to say we're not Nazis, we're not skinheads, but everything else, all the other associations that go with that age, with that era of a lot of enthusiasm. Sweden at this point in time becomes the largest producer of white power music in the world in the middle of the 1990s. I got music in, kind of. But the political advances were nothing. I mean, there's a ton of energy, a ton of emotion with very little political advance to show for it in their mind. whereas they frame themselves today as having got rid of the excess emotion, become more sober, become more professional, and they're moving towards actual political power.
Great.
So that's in a nutshell, I think the importance of dramatizations and characterizations of the movies.
So that's interesting. Do you think that New Democracy then, I mean, perhaps towards the end of it rather than the beginning of it, do you think that would fall under the ethno-nationalist versus the open Swedishness?
So more towards the latter.
Yeah.
I mean, it's important to note also that the movements during the 1990s that coalesced around ethno-nationalism,
Mm-hmm.
they were as much extra ideological as they were ideological. The fact that you had two older men,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
both of them very rich, one knew wealth, the other an aristocrat. That was not the sociology of what got to count as the far right, what got to count as nationalism at the age. They weren't as specific. There was a lot of grievance around what Regan might have called welfare chauvinism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Here we work so hard to build up our welfare, and here come these foreigners to take it over. So the formulations of nationalism, ethno-culturally, were not really articulated, although implicitly I would still place them to the side of not fully qualifying as explicit ideological ethno-nationalists.
And I guess you also have this, I guess one of the ways that 90s stuff has been explained of is just purely in economic terms, right? That there's this unemployment rate, it's a geographically, concentrated unemployment, whereas I guess that may be part of what people think about in the Sweden Democrats as well as with Trump, but it sort of has taken this, it's that kind of populism, that kind of forgotten man thing.
Yeah, absolutely, and that relates to all sides of it.
Yeah.
Sometimes people refer to the national movement in the 90s as Finska klubben, the Finnish club, because the Finnish, Swedish underclass seem to be overrepresented in a lot of the skinhead music and a lot of the militant street games as well.
That's great. I know we have some interesting questions. Maybe we start with Cheryl. Yeah. Okay, we have another interesting question somewhere. Anybody who'd like to ask Ben any questions? Yeah, we'll start maybe back and then come front afterwards. Yeah.
I guess my question is sort of how did you get to this work in progress, given the background you initially started with in terms of analyzing the music and sort of the movements within the music? Do you see, is there any shift in terms of the music? Is it following some of the political in the shape that this new version of ethno-nationalism is taking? And again, this is not an area I know, so this is a very question out in left field a bit, but can you connect the dots for me?
Sure, absolutely. That's an ethnomusicologist doing. Music was important in the old 1990s, 1980s. It was arguably a music movement before anything else. That's why I think if you want to study this, you need to be at least part ethnomusicologist. And music assisted in the transition. And I think in a period of anxiety and trying to figure out, okay, we're not skinheads, well, what are we? Music comes up in lots of different formulations of nationalism and nationalists start to appear in music around 2007, 2011. Since then, as these movements have become more powerful and gained actual hard political power in ways that they never had before, subculture, symbolic campaigning, symbolic activism, which a lot of music was, they were achieving victories in music that they could never hope to achieve in liberal Sweden. All that has started to fade away. There are other parts to that too. That generation, if you look at the main players in the Sweden Democrats and in other extremist groups, they're 40-year-old men today, which is to say teenagers during the 1990s. That generation is aged in subcultural, music-based subcultural association has both become less popular in general in the West, but also we know that as people age, for some reason their tastes change. So for those are just some of the reasons, Nicole, why music has declined. How I got to this particular topic is somewhat complicated. I'm one of few to study these groups through long-term, pretty in-depth ethnography. I know basically everybody on the Swedish side that I quoted in this piece fairly well. I've lived with some of them. And it struck me, as I always thought about my own relationship and how I write about these groups, that it was always kind of easy to be distanced and not neutral, but just dispassionate about the political claims and about their causes, in part because, despite everything, I'm not a Swede. I'm an American and not as invested. But I noticed, as Trump started moving into the scene, as their conversations in social media started doing more and more with Trump, I became interested in the fact that I started, my relationships with them took a very, very different turn when all of a sudden it seemed like their politics and my politics were crossing in a way. So that, in a nutshell, is why I also thought, well, I'm following them, I might as well, let's explore this topic and see if there's something going on here.
This is I'll be short. So you talked, thank you by the way, you did a great job, I think, sort of describing chronologically sort of how especially with the relationship with Trump, how it's sort of changed and who influenced who and whatnot. And then towards the end, you talked a bit about how the Sweden Democrats' support of Trump, you said, I think, stagnated and if not even potentially declined a bit, and that their leader said that, perhaps Trump was probably hurting their image and that's why they wanted to kind of dissociate a little bit, regardless of their actual beliefs of some of the causes that he espouses. So I'm wondering, also you mentioned some of the sort of similarly placed parties around other OECD countries and in Scandinavia in particular. Do you think that Trump's continued foibles, if you will, might cause some of these groups to stagnate or diminish over time? Like, is there actually potentially a positive correlation of Trump making these mistakes and sort of the old or, more prominent rise in some of these groups maybe right just before his time? What do you think about how that will continue to happen over time?
I mean, that's the big question. Again, and it's very good you go there. I don't think at this point we can actually comment on that. We have one thing that we can say about the Sweden Democrats, at least, and they've had one of the more dramatic periods of exchange with Trump because of the Sweden issue that we talked about. UKIP would be another site to look at for exchange because of the friendship between Raj and Trump. But the Sweden Democrats' polling numbers are continuing to rise very steadily, but we don't see any major jumps. I think if you aggregate and average out all the different polls that we've seen, they're all just up quickly. And that's been the trend the whole time. So it's difficult to tell, and they're up even as I think there's some reliable indications that support for Trump among its voters is rising. It could be that they're bringing in new constituencies who were opposed to Trump from the beginning. We need some more detailed data on that front, but in some it's too early. It's too early, but that will be a question that I'm sure I will be far from the only person interested in following.
Yeah.
Okay, so when you're going through your paper, a theme that I repeatedly noticed was that a common thing noticed was, polling numbers for, say, Trump support in Sweden or all this, they were very low and all that kind of. But I'm curious, in your research for this paper, did you take into account the phenomenon of respondents lying or answering incorrectly to the pollsters for fear of having them, for various fears that are just being
The Bradley
racist,
effect.
You get it.
That's always going to be very difficult to gauge because there's not going to be a moment when Sweden votes on Trump, of course, and especially that type of analysis is going to be complicated by the fact that some critical mass of the Sweden Democrats voters dislike Trump but still support SD. So it's not as though we're going to be able to have like a phantom Trump election within Sweden, focusing on them. there's been a lot of talk recently about this issue because in Sweden, this SD, the Sweden Democrats, in cases of almost all the opinion surveys, there are a couple that don't fit this, but they almost always outperform their opinion polls. It seems, if you're talking about an EU election, if you're talking about the the national parliament election, they tend to outperform in much the same way that Trump did to a certain extent and Brexit. Though I was just having, Carly and I were talking about this yesterday, that in Holland, the Freedom Party actually has historically underperformed its numbers. So it changes from place to place, but it will be very difficult, when following opinion polling on a foreign leader, to really see how that plays out, if people are really, in fact, scared to say how much they support him or not. He would have to count as one of the most unpopular figures, world leaders in Sweden at the time, so it wouldn't be surprising for that position to be stigmatized.
We'll go back and then up to Eric.
Me? Okay, just making sure. So I wonder if part of the story here of, what's the difference between Social Democrats and I don't want to say Trump, but the Republicans, right, is actually a story of party discipline.
Sweden
right?
Democrats or Social Democrats?
Sweden Democrats, sorry, I misspoke. Sweden Democrats and Republicans, of which, Trump is a member, right?
Yep.
Is actually one of party discipline. I am reasonably certain that if the Republicans had a better mechanism for kicking Trump out at an early stage, they would have done so. You can see that in Ryan's response to this textbook racism, right? But because we have weak parties in the United States, there just are not great mechanisms for doing that. You have to kind of go through back channels, and of course, certainly it happens, but it's much harder to do that. Whereas in Swedish parties, it's relatively easy to marginalize someone and push them out. And so, it seems to me that we can have two counterfactuals, right? If U.S. parties were more like Swedish parties, we wouldn't have Trump. And if Swedish parties were more like U.S. parties, we might not have Jimmy Åkesson, right? We might have somebody else
Yes.
at the head. And so I wonder if that's part of the story.
That's a very, very insightful comparison. I mean, it's important to note, expulsions in political parties they can happen elsewhere, and they do. They're so much more common on the Sweden Democrats.
Right.
So there's some qualifiers I think I would add to that. Part of their tendency, their trigger happiness, you could say, with expulsions has to do with their past. Yes, we could talk about the political parties elsewhere having more and less extreme factions to them, but it is a distinguishing feature for the Sweden Democrats, even among other far-right parties, especially in Western Europe, that one of their parent organizations was an explicit race ideological ethno-nationalist group with direct music producing ties to an oppositional hooliganistic youth subculture. That's I would be reluctant to see that generalized away in some place or abbreviated. I think that has a lot to do with the party culture that emerged, a party culture that tolerates expulsion. This is also strengthening what you're saying there. The party has struggled to contain its youth organization. The Sweden Democrats' youth, as is often the case with Swedish parties, they're more doctrinaire, more ideological than the mother party, as they refer to it. And the leadership failed twice to inject its own candidate in the youth organization's election and have that candidate win. That each of the two candidates that they put up for election was destroyed against the more radical insider. One of the fellows we saw with the champagne and the red hat earlier. So they have been limited in their ability, but where they've been limited has been a problem for them. And that sort of breakdown between a more refined image and the party's roots came to the fore and terrorized their public profile. And they had to get rid of the entire youth organization, create a new one, and expel about 15 people at once.
One of the things we haven't directly discussed is whether or not on a pan-European or broader European, we talk about Trump and the connections to the United States, but Europe, of course, has similar parties in essentially every country. Mm-hmm. And I think there have been some efforts by something called Pegida to try to unite the anti-immigrant you write, populist movements across Europe. How do Swedish Democrats relate to the movements in France and even more interestingly in Hungary and other Poland, and even the name that hasn't come up yet, this conference, the Russian leader Putin, as a an alternative model, foreign model.
So this is a key part of the story, so I'm glad you asked this Aaron. And it goes along with this paradox about the Sweden Democrats in Sweden, that they ideologically, in terms of their policy proposals, the rhetoric they tolerate, they belong to a more moderate side. But they have these cultural and historical connections to extremism, so what do? The way that's played out in terms of alliance building, and it's easier to follow, not with Pegida, because that was more or less a kind of intra-Germany campaign, but rather at the EU level, where you look at coalitions of parties and who gets to belong with whom. There, the Sweden Democrats would most like to be in partnerships with the Danish People's Party and the Progress Party from Norway. These governing, respectable political parties who can belong in coalitions and are seen more or less as being, yes, a rightist version of a mainstream movement. However, the Danish People's Party, the Norwegian Progress Party, they don't want anything to have anything to do with the Sweden Democrats because they're a bunch of angry young white men, who seem to have a penchant for short haircuts and things like that. It is very much a matter of culture. That's why I don't think the study of the Sweden Democrats can be confined to intellectual historians or political, more narrowly defined political scientists. You have to look at that cultural baggage. On the other hand, the parties that would like to be with the Sweden Democrats include the National Front in France, could include, let's say, Fidesz in Hungary, the ruling party, but Fidesz is in a coalition with the moderates from Sweden, oddly enough. It might include Jobbik in Hungary. It certainly could include some of the similar parties in Poland and in Ukraine, but the Sweden Democrats don't want to be with them. It was only very recently that they found a coalition, and that was with UKIP in Great Britain, where they found what they considered to be the right balance of respectability, but also a party that was willing to have them, despite their history, together. But that has limited their ability to conduct politics at the EU level as well. They've been this wild third wheel, you could say, in many instances.
I mean, in a sense, it's kind of ironic because for many years there was the myth of socialist or communist internationalism. And that was phony, but it was still plausible.
Yeah.
The idea of national chauvinists unite across borders is kind of
And I didn't get to the Putin thing. It's also a matter that their nationalisms, their understandings of the national people, they are irreconcilable. And the assertive Russia that is celebrated by some forces is a real menace to the Sweden Democrats, among others, the authoritarianism of Putin and Orban as well in Hungary is the sort of thing that they have pushed against. It's a question of whether or not their opposition to those figures is just a matter of the party elite, and if it might be overcome in some future turnover.
I see a couple other questions, but I've been told that we need to take those to a coffee break. So let us all thank Ben for a wonderful talk.